The notification blinked onto Detective Emmy Rodriguez's computer screen at precisely 2:47 on a grey Thursday afternoon in March of 2024, and though she had worked cold cases for nearly 2 decades with the Illinois State Police, she instantly felt the weight behind it before she even clicked. The CODIS alert had only been in her inbox for a few minutes, but the case number froze her in place. Sarah Michelle Henderson, missing since September 12, 1968. Last file update 2019. Rodriguez leaned back in her chair, the harsh glow of the fluorescent lights bouncing off the endless stack of manila folders on her desk, and let the enormity sink in. For 56 years, Sarah's name had lingered like an echo in the archives, and back when she vanished, DNA was nothing more than a futuristic theory tucked inside academic journals. Yet here, on an outdated monitor in Springfield headquarters, was irrefutable proof. The genetic profile of Thomas James Carlyle, flagged posthumously after a domestic violence arrest in Kane County, matched biological material scraped decades ago from a torn blue cardigan. That sweater had once belonged to a 16-year-old girl who never made it to school on her bicycle one quiet September morning in Millbrook, Illinois. The fact that Carlyle had been dead for 6 years made the match all the more haunting, a ghost reaching across time to answer questions the living had failed to resolve. The breakthrough came thanks to a statewide initiative launched only the year before, which pulled thousands of forgotten samples out of dusty evidence rooms and subjected them to cutting-edge extraction methods capable of teasing DNA from fragments of fabric and microscopic traces invisible to the human eye. When Rodriguez opened Sarah's digitized file, grainy black and white photographs loaded painfully slow, showing a bright-eyed honor student, the daughter of wheat farmers Margaret and Robert Henderson, whose biggest worry should have been homework rather than survival. She had been pedaling the same rural route to Millbrook High School she had traveled for 3 years, but that Tuesday morning would be her last. Sheriff Douglas Walsh's original investigation had filled nearly 4 inches of paper reports and witness statements. Meticulous for its time, yet shackled by the limitations of 1960s law enforcement. No phone records to ping, no security cameras to scan, no digital footprints to follow. Only intuition, testimony, and fragile physical evidence remained. Typed unevenly on a manual typewriter, the inventory listed the torn cardigan, unidentified fibers, and fabric scraps, collected from Bramwell Road and County Line 4. Back then, they were nothing more than curiosities. Today, they whispered secrets only modern science could unlock. Secrets that would eventually expose the truth behind Sarah's disappearance. But before the science, before the analysis, there was that farmhouse 3 miles east of Millbrook where Margaret Henderson had stirred scrambled eggs and bacon while her daughter sat unusually quiet, eyes drifting somewhere far away. It was a morning that should have disappeared into memory, like any other day. Instead, it became frozen in time. A simple breakfast turned into the prologue of a tragedy that would span more than half a century. That Tuesday morning carried a subtle strangeness, one Margaret Henderson couldn't quite name at the time, but would describe years later as a kind of quiet distance in her daughter's demeanor, seemed lost in thought, as though turning over something weighty in her mind. Dressed in her favorite blue cardigan, layered over a crisp white blouse, the same outfit she had proudly worn for school pictures the week before, Sarah climbed onto her bicycle, a blue Schwinn Breeze her parents had gifted her on her 15th birthday. The ride to Millbrook High should have taken her 18 minutes, a route she had memorized down to the second, pedaling along Henderson Road, cutting onto Bramwell, and eventually north on County Line 4, where the town's landmarks, the grain elevator, the Lutheran church, the sidewalks that replaced gravel marked the end of her rural solitude. Her father, Robert, kissed her goodbye at exactly 7 o'clock, the moment stamped in his memory by the grain futures report on the radio. Margaret stood at the kitchen window, bread dough clinging to her hands, and watched Sarah glide down the oak-lined driveway, blonde hair catching the September sun, one hand lifted in a casual wave. That simple gesture, ordinary at the time, would become the image etched into her memory, beautiful and unbearable all at once. By 8 o'clock, her homeroom teacher, Patricia Dobson, noted her absence, unusual for a girl who had missed only a handful of days in her entire academic career. When Sarah failed to show up for second-period English, Principal William Fraser called the Henderson farm. Margaret answered, flour dusting her apron, and her world tilted when she learned Her daughter had never arrived at school. The first concrete sign came at 11:47, when neighbor Dale Morrison discovered Sarah's Schwinn lying on its side in the tall grass near the intersection of Bramwell and County Line 4. The bike was intact, its chain aligned, tires inflated. Her books sat neatly in the wire basket: algebra, English literature, a spiral notebook filled with her tidy handwriting, along with her lunch, an untouched apple and a fresh sandwich Margaret had packed that morning. It was as if Sarah had simply vanished mid-ride, leaving her belongings undisturbed. Sheriff Douglas Walsh, a seasoned but weary 58-year-old nearing retirement, had spent over 3 decades handling farm disputes, local disturbances, and seasonal troubles, but nothing in his long career prepared him for a missing child. Within hours, Walsh mobilized every resource at his disposal: 3 deputies, the volunteer fire department, and even civil defense volunteers more accustomed to tornado drills than manhunts. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, nearly 60 people were combing the fields, ditches, and fence lines, working in military-style grid patterns. Walsh had once learned during his service in Korea. The calm rhythm of rural life had been shattered, replaced by the urgency of neighbors scouring the countryside, each step driven by the unspoken fear that Sarah's trail might already be slipping away. The farmland around Millbrook turned the search into both a blessing and a curse. Endless flat fields offered wide sight lines, yet the late summer corn, towering nearly 8 feet high, created a claustrophobic maze where someone could vanish just steps from the road. Volunteers fanned out, voices calling Sarah's name again and again, the sound mingling with the whisper of dry stalks and the low drone of harvest machinery in the distance. Margaret refused to stay behind, despite Sheriff Walsh's gentle, urging. Her anguished cries for her daughter carried over the fields, a haunting chorus that seared itself into the memories of those who searched beside her. As night fell on that first day, Walsh knew his small department was outmatched. At 9:30 that evening, Lieutenant Frank Kowalski arrived from Springfield with state police technicians and a pair of bloodhounds. The dogs followed Sarah's scent faithfully from her bedroom along her familiar bicycle route, but the trail dissolved at the very intersection where her Schwinn was discovered, as though she had simply evaporated from the earth. On the 3rd day, the FBI stepped in. Special Agent Richard Barnes, a seasoned Chicago investigator with a reputation for methodical thoroughness, set up a command post in the Millbrook fire station, wiring in multiple phone lines and coordinating with agencies in Illinois, Indiana, and Iowa. Within days, the search force swelled to nearly 300 volunteers. Farmers left their fields unharvested, knowing time mattered more than crops, guiding teams into creek beds, wooded groves, and derelict barns only locals would think to check. Families brought food, coffee from the Morrisons' meals organized by the Lutheran Church, keeping searchers fueled as they pushed on. Sheriff Walsh documented everything meticulously, snapping Polaroids of tire tracks in soft earth, cigarette butts in ditches, even bits of fabric tangled on fence wire. Most amounted to nothing, but he knew from experience that the smallest, overlooked detail could someday unlock the truth. By the end of September, they had combed more than 40 square miles and interviewed over 200 people, including every man between 16 and 60 within a 10-mile radius. They checked parolees, drifters, and farmhands, but with no trace of Sarah, the frantic search slowly gave way to the chilling silence of an unsolved case. As October's harvest stripped the cornfields bare, the absence of answers grew heavier. Margaret's grief transformed into ritual. She preserved Sarah's bedroom like a museum of suspended time, the yellow bedspread smoothed each morning, ceramic horses on the windowsill carefully dusted, algebra homework left open to page 47, pencil still angled exactly as Sarah had set it down the night before she vanished. In those early months, the preservation felt like hope, as though one day her daughter might simply walk back in and pick up where she left off. Margaret convinced herself that keeping Sarah's room untouched was an act of faith, a fragile bridge between past and future that might one day guide her daughter home. But as the years slipped from 1968 into 69 and then into the new decade, the room transformed from a sanctuary of hope into a shrine of loss. Robert, unable to endure the sight of Margaret's late-night vigils, her fragile frame perched on the edge of Sarah's bed, clutching her favorite cardigan and whispering to a daughter who could not answer, moved permanently into the guest room. Each September 12th, Margaret dressed in her best clothes and drove the 8 miles to Sheriff Walsh's office, demanding that Sarah's missing person report be refiled. The law did not require it, but Margaret believed the ritual kept her daughter's name alive in the system, a shield against the cruel possibility of being forgotten. Walsh, and later Sheriff James Miller, received her with quiet patience, even as her filings grew longer, stranger, and steeped in theories that leaned more on desperation than evidence. By the mid-70s, Margaret had become convinced that Sarah was the victim of a coordinated network, trafficking young girls across the Midwest. A conviction fed by her growing correspondence with other grieving parents, clippings from true crime magazines, and frantic letters to the FBI that drew connections where none existed. The weight of obsession took its toll. Robert, once steady and light-hearted, grew withdrawn, turning to alcohol to blunt the edges of grief, while Margaret transformed Sarah's bedroom into a chaotic command post. Maps covered the walls, crisscrossed with pins marking other disappearances, timelines scrawled in uneven handwriting, and photographs of suspects Margaret had gathered from clippings and amateur detectives. The community that once wrapped around her with sympathy began to retreat. Church gatherings became strained under Margaret's unpredictable outbursts, sometimes inconsolable tears, sometimes laughter at inappropriate moments, as her thoughts wandered to Sarah. Invitations stopped coming, not out of malice, but because Margaret's presence turned every gathering into another forum for theories and sorrow. The slow fracture of the Henderson family reached its cruelest breaking point in 1987, when Robert collapsed from a heart attack in the barn. Though the death certificate listed cardiac arrest, everyone in Millbrook knew grief had been wearing him down for 19 long years. Margaret found him at noon on a Tuesday, a bitter echo of the Tuesday morning when Sarah had vanished. And then, nearly 3 decades after Sarah disappeared, fate intervened in the most unassuming way. In August of 1995, Detective Patricia O'Brien was assigned to inventory the courthouse basement as part of a digitization project. Beneath concrete walls and decades of neglected files, she stumbled upon a battered cardboard banker's box, mislabeled and water-stained from an old pipe leak. Inside lay the Henderson evidence, misplaced for nearly 27 years, dusty, damaged, but still holding secrets that time and human error had nearly buried forever. Detective Patricia O'Brien almost passed over the battered box, mistaking it for just another stack of property deeds or probate records that crowded the courthouse basement shelves. But when she pried it open, she uncovered a case that had gone cold long before her career even began. Inside lay the original evidence inventory, typed on yellowed paper where the E key struck awkwardly higher than the rest, listing items painstakingly catalogued during the frantic days of Sarah Henderson's disappearance. Most were dead-end soil samples that told nothing, photographs of tire tracks too faint to match, witness statements that had drifted into silence. Yet beneath the clutter of bagged debris and faded Polaroids rested something extraordinary. Evidence bag number 7, containing Sarah's blue cardigan, the very sweater she had worn on that September morning in 1968, torn sharply at the left shoulder. It bore the signature of sudden violence, not the gentle wear of daily use. Alongside it were envelopes marked unknown fiber samples and fabric fragments, collected by FBI technician Robert Chen, whose meticulous habits had been praised even in the original reports. With tweezers and patience, Chen had lifted threads from the tier that clearly did not belong to Sarah's sweater, dark cotton fibers, likely from heavy work clothes or outerwear. Back then, microscopes could show texture but not identity. Science was still blind to the secrets locked inside those threads. Now, in 1995, DNA analysis had become routine, and new techniques allowed biological material to be pulled from even the smallest fibers. The fragments told a tangled story. Some matched Sarah's white blouse, but others came from garments entirely different. One bearing a tear edged with what Chen had cautiously described as possible biological material. O'Brien photographed everything with modern precision, sealed the samples according to updated chain of custody rules, and realized the irony. 3 decades of neglect in that musty basement had inadvertently preserved them well. The cool dryness acting as a guardian against time. Carrying the box upstairs, she felt the pulse of possibility, knowing these forgotten scraps might finally reveal what happened to the Henderson girl and close a wound that had haunted a family for over a quarter century. For Michael Henderson, Sarah's little brother, who was only 8 when she vanished. The discovery would mean more than evidence. By the time their mother Margaret passed in 2019, her body surrendered to emphysema and a heart eroded by 5 decades of unrelenting grief. Sarah had long since become a ghost in their household, less sister than legend. Michael had lived 51 years in that shadow, defined by a sister frozen forever at 16. A myth carried in whispers and photographs, waiting for truth to bring her back into the realm of the real. Margaret's life ended quietly on a frozen February morning, the Illinois countryside gripped by a winter that refused to loosen its hold. Michael found her in Sarah's bedroom, where she had spent her final months surrounded by half a century of obsession, the walls layered with maps, photographs, clippings, and hand-scribbled timelines that spiraled from a shrine into something resembling a war room of grief. At the Lutheran cemetery, where Robert had been laid to rest 32 years earlier, Pastor Williams spoke gently of Margaret's devotion and persistence, carefully sidestepping the truth that her mind had fractured long before her body gave out. The funeral was small, attended only by those few in Millbrook who still remembered the Hendersons before tragedy consumed their name. Afterward, Michael walked into a house that felt less like a home and more like an archive of sorrow. The basement sagged under the weight of Boxar's police reports, letters to federal agents, exchanges with psychics, stacks of clippings from true crime magazines, all jumbled together in a system that only Margaret's unraveling logic could follow. Yet, buried amid the chaos, Michael discovered something remarkable, evidence of serious work that had been ignored because it was tangled with her more erratic theories. Margaret had built a network with families across Illinois, Indiana, and Iowa, comparing disappearances that, viewed together, hinted at patterns no single sheriff's office could ever see: clusters of vanished girls near major highways, timed in hauntingly similar waves. Michael inherited his mother's determination, but brought to it a steadiness she had lost. A lifetime in agricultural equipment sales had taught him that even the most complex machines yielded to patient, systematic analysis. Where Margaret leapt from theory to theory, Michael began carefully scanning every scrap of paper, every photograph, digitizing his mother's universe of grief into something searchable, measurable, real. The turning point came when he reached out to Patricia O'Brien, now retired, but still consulting for the Illinois State Police. O'Brien had never entirely let Sarah's case slip from her mind, returning to it whenever new forensic methods surfaced. When Michael explained how he had digitized Margaret's archive, she immediately recognized the potential. The marriage of Margaret's dogged, often chaotic research with modern DNA technology offered a chance to solve a mystery that had haunted the Midwest for more than 50 years. Unlike his mother, Michael wasn't driven by fragile hope of Sarah walking through the door. He was driven by duty to honor a sister he barely knew, and a mother who had surrendered her life to the search. He knew the truth, once found, could not bring them back. But he also understood something essential. If the case was allowed to fade with Margaret's death, then all those years of suffering would have been for nothing. In the original investigation, Thomas Carlyle had slipped through the cracks almost effortlessly. Questioned once in October of 1968, during the routine canvassing of nearby residents, he told a deputy that he'd been repairing farm equipment the morning Sarah vanished. The deputy, working alone and overwhelmed by the sheer scope of the search, found nothing suspicious, and Carlyle's name appeared just once in the thousands of pages generated that fall. Decades later, Detective Rodriguez would uncover what the original team could not: a pattern of predatory violence stretching across counties, buried beneath the fractured silos of predigital record-keeping and the protective silences of small-town life. For 3 weeks in November 2023, she crisscrossed central Illinois, digging through courthouse basements, old police logs, and yellowed newspaper clippings. Piece by piece, a disturbing picture emerged. In 1969, less than a year after Sarah disappeared, 19-year-old waitress Lisa Morrison reported being stalked and then attacked in a Gibson City parking lot by a man with a distinctive scar on his left hand, the same scar Carlyle bore from a farm accident. The case was quietly closed when Morrison moved to Chicago and stopped cooperating, likely out of fear. Similar stories repeated through the 70s and 80s. Teenage girls, alone on rural roads, ambushed by a man who seemed to melt into the darkness when headlights approached. All were between 15 and 19, all with blonde or light brown hair, eerily echoing Sarah's profile. The true breakthrough came not from a lab, but from memory passed down between detectives. Rodriguez tracked down Frank Kowalski Jr., the son of the state police lieutenant who had worked Sarah's case in 1968, inheriting his father's private files after his death in 2009. The younger Kowalski had unknowingly preserved a thread of the investigation that never made it into official records. Inside a folder labeled Similar Incidents Unconfirmed Connection were pages of his father's notes documenting suspicions about Carlyle as early as 1971. Kowalski Sr. had even conducted quiet, unofficial surveillance of Carlyle's farm, recording troubling observations but never gathering enough for a warrant. That long-dormant suspicion suddenly had teeth when Rodriguez approached David Carlyle, Thomas's only son, with the DNA evidence linking his father to Sarah. He granted full access to the family property on Route 7. He admitted he had grown up under the shadow of his father's brutality toward his mother and had long feared what else Thomas might have been capable of. On December 4, 2023, investigators converged on the Carlyle property armed with cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar tools, unheard of in 1960. As the machines pulsed into the earth and dogs sniffed at the soil, Rodriguez knew they were about to unearth not only answers for the Henderson family, but perhaps the hidden scenes of a man who had hunted young women in silence for decades. When investigators swept the Carlyle property in December 2023, the truth finally clawed its way out of the earth. Though the farmhouse had been demolished 3 years earlier, the soil still kept its secrets. Beneath the old basement foundation, searchers unearthed a rusted metal toolbox, a grim time capsule filled with trophies from a predator's life. Inside were trinkets, scraps of clothing, and jewelry objects that matched descriptions from missing person cases stretching across 2 decades. Among them was a tiny ceramic horse, nearly identical to those Sarah Henderson once displayed on her bedroom windowsill, lovingly dusted by her mother for years after her disappearance. Photographs from the 1968 investigation confirmed the match. It was the most chilling confirmation yet. Sarah had been inside Carlyle's house, her innocence stolen and memorialized in a box of stolen lives. For Michael Henderson, the discovery was equal parts agony and relief. After 55 years, the proof of his sister's fate had been dug from the ground, though justice itself remained unreachable. Carlyle was already 6 years dead, beyond the reach of trial, sentencing, or the eyes of the families he had devastated. Detective Rodriguez pressed forward, piecing together the magnitude of his crimes. Forensic testing linked him definitively to 3 additional disappearances and circumstantially tied him to at least 7 more, including the vanished lives of Jennifer Walsh in 1974 and Maria Santos in 1981. Their belongings buried alongside Sarah's horse in the earth beneath Route 7. Each artifact spoke not just of theft but of ritual, a predator's archive of power and cruelty. What stunned Rodriguez most was how close investigators had come back in 1968. Detective Frank Kowalski Sr. had secured a warrant to search Carlyle's farm based on witness sightings of his pickup near County Line on the morning Sarah disappeared. But bureaucratic delays pushed the search 2 weeks late, giving Carlyle time to scrub the property clean. When the search finally took place that December, it was limited in scope and blind to what lay just beyond their reach. Without the benefit of cadaver dogs or ground-penetrating radar, the hidden cache remained undiscovered. Still, Kowalski Sr. had never stopped watching Carlyle. His private notes, resurrected decades later, revealed a pattern he had sensed but could not prove. Wherever Carlyle's shadow fell, young women went missing. The pieces had always been there, scattered across counties and time, but only in 2023 did they finally converge to reveal the dark truth that had haunted Millbrook for more than half a century. Detective Rodriguez's investigation reached its final, bittersweet conclusion with the help of Detective Kowalski's long-buried notes, records that showed just how close his father had come to identifying Thomas Carlyle more than half a century earlier. Those notes revealed a tragic irony. Carlyle's violence had grown bolder after escaping suspicion in Sarah's case. Having slipped through the cracks in 1968, he gained the confidence to stalk and attack more young women for decades, leaving behind a trail of shattered lives that might have been spared if evidence and jurisdictional barriers had not failed so profoundly. By January 2024, Rodriguez had pieced together enough evidence to close 8 cold cases across 4 counties, and state attorneys formally declared that Carlisle would have been charged with Sarah Henderson's murder had he still been alive, to stand trial. On January 18th, Rodriguez made the call to Michael Henderson, 55 years and 4 months after Sarah vanished. Michael listened from his Springfield home office as Rodriguez's steady voice carried both the triumph of resolution and the tragedy of justice denied. Sarah's case was officially closed, her death confirmed by DNA evidence, and the haunting recovery of her ceramic horse from Carlisle's hidden cache. Relief washed through Michael, but it tangled with grief, for the sister he barely remembered, for the parents who had died without answers, and with anger at the decades of unnecessary suffering. Weeks later, Rodriguez arranged for Michael to view the evidence. In a quiet conference room at Illinois State Police headquarters, Michael's hands trembled as he held the small cream and gold ceramic mare, faded from decades underground, but instantly recognizable as the piece his parents had given Sarah for her 14th birthday. In that moment, the past became tangible. Sarah was no longer only a memory blurred by time, but a sister whose presence could be felt again. On March 15, 2024, 55.5 years after Sarah's disappearance, the Millbrook Lutheran Church filled with neighbors, old search volunteers, and strangers moved by her story. Michael spoke about persistence, about the remarkable power of modern forensic science to resurrect truths thought forever buried, and about the importance of communities that never stop caring. He announced the creation of the Sarah Henderson Foundation, a non-profit dedicated to supporting families of the missing in rural America and strengthening the very law enforcement communication networks that had once failed his sister. Funded by an insurance settlement tied to Sarah's confirmed death, the foundation would provide training, forensic resources, and interagency tools to prevent future families from enduring the limbo that had defined the Hendersons' existence. Standing by Sarah's new memorial marker, placed beside his parents' graves in the Lutheran cemetery, Michael felt the burden of 55 years lift, his mother's relentless vigil, his father's silent grief, and his own lifelong shadow finally yielded to truth. Sarah's story had an ending at last, one of pain, but also of legacy. She could rest in peace, and through the foundation in her name, her memory would protect others from the silence that had once swallowed her whole.